Welcome, dear friends, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where ancient mysteries meet peaceful slumber. I'm your guide through the shadows of history, where forgotten civilizations whisper their secrets to those who dare to listen. Tonight, we journey to a place that challenges everything we thought we knew about the beginning of human civilization. Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders as we travel back in time, not just centuries or millennia, but 11,000 years into the past. We're going to a windswept hill in southeastern Turkey, where the dry plains of Anatolia stretch endlessly toward distant horizons. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe, a name that means potbelly hill in Turkish, though its true significance reaches far beyond such humble origins. Here, beneath layers of earth and time, lies what may be humanity's first temple, built by people who had not yet learned to farm, who had not yet discovered pottery, who lived as nomadic hunters and gatherers beneath the same stars that shine. Down upon us tonight, picture, if you will, the landscape as it was then. The year is approximately 9600 BCE. The great ice sheets that once covered much of the northern world are retreating, leaving behind a changed Earth. The climate is shifting, becoming warmer, more hospitable. In this corner of what we now call Turkey, the land rises in gentle swells and falls, creating natural amphitheaters where ancient peoples might gather. But this particular hill, this unassuming mound rising from the Anatolian plateau, holds secrets that would remain buried for nearly 12,000 years. Secrets that, when finally revealed, would shake the very foundations of how we understand our own beginnings. Let your mind drift now to that distant time. There are no cities here, no permanent settlements of any kind. The people who walk these hills follow the rhythms of the seasons, the migrations of animals, the ripening of wild grains. They carry their possessions on their backs, their knowledge in their hearts, their dreams and the stories they tell around flickering fires. Yet somehow, impossibly, these same people conceived and built something magnificent, something that required not just physical labor, but vision, coordination, and a shared sense of purpose that we can barely comprehend. They carved massive stone pillars from solid limestone, each one weighing as much as several elephants. They decorated these pillars with intricate reliefs of animals, symbols whose meanings are lost to us now, but which clearly held profound significance for their creators. And then, after centuries of use, after generations of pilgrimage and ceremony, they deliberately buried it all beneath tons of earth and stone, as if to hide it from the world, or perhaps to preserve it for a future they could only imagine. Tonight, we'll walk among these ancient stones in our minds. We'll try to understand the people who built this place, what drove them to such extraordinary effort, and what their creation tells us about the very nature of human consciousness and community. We'll explore the possibility that religion, not agriculture, was the true catalyst for civilization, and that the need to gather, to worship, to create meaning from the chaos of existence predates even our most basic survival innovations. Wind still blows across that Turkish hillside, carrying with it the whispers of those ancient builders. Their voices echo in the silence between the stones, in the shadows cast by structures that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. They speak of a time when the world was young, when humanity was taking its first tentative steps towards something greater than mere survival. So settle in, dear listeners, and let these ancient mysteries wash over you like a gentle tide. Let the story of Göbekli carry you into peaceful dreams, where the boundaries between past and present dissolve, and where the deepest truths of human existence reveal themselves in the quiet hours before dawn. We begin our journey now, in the long shadows of evening, as the sun sets over the hills of Anatolia, just as it did 11,000 years ago, illuminating the same timeless landscape where our ancestors first dared to dream of eternity. The year was 1994, And the world of archaeology was about to be forever changed by a discovery that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the dawn of civilization. But our story begins much earlier, in the 1960s, when a team of American archaeologists first surveyed the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey as part of a broader regional study. They noted an unremarkable mound covered in scattered limestone fragments and classified it simply as a medieval cemetery. The broken stones, they assumed, were the remains of old grave markers, nothing more. For decades, this assessment went unquestioned. Göbekli Tepe, this potbelly hill, remained just another gentle rise in the landscape, its secrets buried beneath centuries of wind-blown soil and the casual dismissal of academic certainty. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was re-examining the earlier survey data when something caught his attention. The description of the site didn't quite fit the evidence he was seeing. Those limestone fragments scattered across the surface, they were too large, too deliberately shaped to be simple grave markers. There was something else here, something that whispered of far greater antiquity and purpose. Schmidt was a meticulous man, trained in the rigorous methods of German archaeology. He had spent years excavating sites across the Middle East, developing an almost intuitive sense for reading the subtle signs that separate the significant from the mundane. When he first climbed that unassuming hill in the autumn of 1994, he carried with him not just the tools of his trade, but decades of experience that had taught him to listen to what the earth was trying to tell him. The first test excavation revealed stones that defied immediate explanation. These were not the rough-hewn markers of a medieval cemetery, but massive, precisely carved pillars that had been deliberately arranged in complex patterns. As Schmidt and his team carefully brushed away the accumulated dirt of millennia, they began to uncover something extraordinary. The pillars were T-shaped, carved from single blocks of limestone, each one reaching heights of 15 to 20 feet and weighing between 10 and 20 tons. But it was not just their size that took Schmidt's breath away. It was their age. Carbon dating of organic materials found in the same layers revealed a date that seemed impossible. That violated everything archaeologists thought they knew about the progression of human civilization. 11,000 years old. Older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. These massive stone monuments had been erected by people who, according to conventional wisdom, should not have possessed the organizational skills, the technological knowledge, or the social structures necessary for such an undertaking. As Schmidt stood among those ancient pillars in the fading light of that first day of excavation, he realized he was looking at evidence that would rewrite the textbooks. Here was proof that the development of human civilization had not followed the neat, linear progression that scholars had long assumed. Agriculture had not necessarily preceded monumental architecture. Permanent settlements had not necessarily come before organized religion. The very foundations of archaeological theory were crumbling like ancient mortar. But Schmidt was a careful scientist, and he understood that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Over the following years, he would return to Göbekli Tepe season after season, gradually revealing the true scope of what lay buried beneath that Turkish hillside. Each new discovery only deepened the mystery and expanded the implications of what he had found. The site, it became clear, was not a single temple, but a complex of temples, built and rebuilt over a period of 1,500 years. There were at least 20 circular enclosures, each one containing multiple T-shaped pillars arranged in careful patterns. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, displaying a level of skill and artistry that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge and technique. But perhaps most remarkably, the entire complex appeared to have been deliberately buried around 8,000 BCE. covered with tons of earth and stone in what seemed to be an intentional act of concealment or preservation. For 8,000 years, Göbekli Tepe had slept beneath the earth, waiting for someone with the vision to recognize its significance. Schmidt often spoke of the profound sense of connection he felt when walking among those ancient stones. Here, he would say, you could almost hear the voices of the builders, feel the presence of the countless generations who had gathered in this sacred space to perform rituals whose meaning we can only guess at. The pillars themselves seemed to watch over the site like silent sentinels, their carved reliefs of animals and abstract symbols hinting at a rich symbolic language that predated writing by thousands of years. As news of the discovery spread through the archaeological community, scholars from around the world began to grapple with its implications. If hunter-gatherer societies could conceive and execute such monumental projects, what did that say about our understanding of prehistoric social organization? If religious architecture preceded agricultural settlements, what did that suggest about the role of spiritual beliefs in the development of civilization? The discovery of Göbekli Tepe was like finding a missing piece of a puzzle that revealed the entire picture to be far more complex and fascinating than anyone had imagined. It was a humbling reminder that the past still holds secrets, that there are chapters in the human story that we are only beginning to read. And so, on that hillside in Turkey, under the same stars that had witnessed the temple's construction 11 millennia ago, Klaus Schmidt had uncovered not just an archaeological site, but a doorway to a deeper understanding of who we are and where we came from. The stones of Göbekli Tepe had begun to speak, and their message would echo through the corridors of academic thought for generations to come. To understand the profound mystery of Göbekli Tepe, we must first understand the land itself, for the choice of location reveals as much about the builders' intentions as the monuments they left behind. Picture yourself standing on this ancient hilltop, feeling the wind that has blown across these plains for millennia, carrying with it the whispers of countless generations. The site sits at an elevation of approximately 2,500 feet above sea level, commanding a sweeping view of the Mesopotamian plains that stretch endlessly toward the horizon. This is the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land where agriculture would eventually take root and flourish. But at the time of Göbekli Tepe's construction, this transformation lay thousands of years in the future. The landscape here is one of austere beauty, painted in shades of gold and amber under the relentless Anatolian sun. Rolling hills covered in scrubland and scattered oak trees create a natural amphitheater, while limestone outcroppings push through the earth like the bones of some ancient giant. The soil is thin and rocky, not particularly suited to farming even today, despite modern agricultural techniques and irrigation systems. What strikes you immediately about this location is its isolation. There are no major rivers here, no natural harbors, no obvious sources of abundant game or wild grains. The nearest significant water source is the Euphrates River, flowing some 30 miles to the east. By all conventional logic, this should have been a place that ancient peoples passed through rather than settled in, a way station rather than a destination. Yet the builders of Göbekli Tepe chose this spot with deliberate intent, and their choice speaks to motivations that transcend mere survival or convenience. From the summit of the hill, the view extends in every direction for dozens of miles. On clear days, you can see mountain ranges in the distance, their peaks creating a natural boundary that defines the world of the ancients who gathered here. The position offers something invaluable to a people who lived by reading the subtle signs of nature, perspective. From this elevated vantage point, one could observe the movements of animal herds across the plains, track the seasonal changes in vegetation, and most importantly, study the movements of the stars and planets across the vast dome of the sky. For the hunter-gatherer societies of the 10th millennium BCE, Astronomical knowledge was not merely academic curiosity, but a matter of survival. The positions of celestial bodies marked the changing seasons, indicated the times for migration, and provided the calendar by which their entire lives were organized. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had chosen a location that functioned as a natural observatory, a place where the rhythms of heaven and earth could be observed and understood. The climate here is harsh and unforgiving. Summers are blistering hot, with temperatures often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while winters bring bitter cold and occasional snow. The spring and autumn months offer more temperate conditions, but even then, the wind that sweeps across these heights can chill you to the bone. It is not a place where one would choose to live year-round, but rather a place where one might come for specific purposes at specific times. Archaeological evidence suggests that Göbekli Tepe was indeed a seasonal gathering place, a site where scattered bands of hunter-gatherers would converge during certain times of the year to participate in rituals and ceremonies whose exact nature remains tantalizingly beyond our understanding. The lack of permanent habitation structures, the absence of cooking hearths and storage facilities, all point to a site that was visited rather than inhabited. But what drew these ancient peoples to make such journeys? What compelled them to travel hundreds of miles across difficult terrain to reach this windswept hilltop? The answer, perhaps, lies in the unique spiritual qualities of the location itself. There is something about elevated places that speaks to the human soul, something that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries. Mountains and hills have been considered sacred by peoples across the world and throughout history, from the Greek temples perched on cliff tops to the Andean shrines built at impossible altitudes. There is a sense of being closer to the divine, of standing at the threshold between the earthly and the celestial. The builders of Göbekli Tepe understood this instinctively. They recognized that the hill possessed qualities that made it suitable for communion with forces beyond the material world. The elevation provided not just physical perspective, but spiritual perspective, a place where the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds grew thin. The stone itself tells part of the story. The limestone that forms the bedrock of the hill is of exceptional quality, easy to carve when fresh, but hardening to remarkable durability when exposed to air. It was as if the earth itself had provided the perfect medium for the builder's vision, offering them the raw materials they needed to create something that would endure for millennia. As you stand on this ancient summit today, you can feel the weight of history pressing down upon you. The modern world seems to fade away, replaced by a timeless landscape that has changed little since the temple builders walked these same paths. The wind carries the same sense of wild herbs and sun-baked stone, the same silence broken only by the cry of circling birds. In the distance, the lights of modern cities twinkle like earthbound stars. But here on the hill, surrounded by the massive stone pillars that have stood sentinel for 11,000 years, you are transported back to a time when humanity was young and the world was full of mystery. The builders chose this place, not for its convenience or its resources, but for its power to transform those who came here, to lift them out of the ordinary concerns of daily life and into communion with something greater. The lonely summit of Göbekli Tepe stands as a testament to the human need for transcendence, for places where the soul can soar above the mundane realities of existence. It reminds us that our ancestors, even in their apparent simplicity, possessed a sophisticated understanding of the spiritual dimensions of landscape and location. They knew that where we choose to worship shapes how we worship, and that some places are inherently sacred, calling to us across the centuries with voices we can barely hear but cannot ignore. As dawn breaks over the ancient site, the first light of morning illuminates the most enigmatic features of Göbekli Tepe, the massive, T-shaped pillars that stand like silent guardians across the complex. These monumental stones, each one a masterpiece, of prehistoric engineering and artistry, hold secrets that continue to perplex archaeologists and inspire wonder in all who encounter them. Imagine approaching one of these pillars for the first time, your footsteps echoing softly on the limestone floor as you draw near. The sheer scale is breathtaking, rising 15 to 20 feet into the air, some weighing as much as 20 tons. These are not mere markers or boundary stones, but deliberate creations that required extraordinary effort and skill to produce. Each pillar was carved from a single block of limestone, quarried from the bedrock of the hill itself, shaped with tools of flint and copper into forms that speak of profound symbolic meaning. The T-shape itself is deceptively simple, yet it has sparked endless debate among scholars. At first glance, it might seem like an abstract symbol, perhaps representing the meeting of earth and sky, the horizontal and vertical dimensions of existence. But as you study the pillars more closely, a different interpretation begins to emerge, one that is both more human and more mysterious. Look carefully at the narrow sides of the pillars, and you begin to see details that transform your understanding. Here, carved in low relief, are arms bent at the elbow, hands positioned at the sides. Here are belts, carved with intricate detail, cinching what appears to be a waist. Some pillars bear the suggestion of clothing, simple garments that drape across the stone surface. These are not abstract symbols at all, but representations of the human form, stylized and monumentalized on a scale that dwarfs the actual humans who created them. But these are humans without heads, without faces, without the individual characteristics that would identify them as specific people. They are archetypal figures, representations of humanity in its most essential form. The T-shape that caps each pillar is not a symbol, but a simplification, a way of suggesting the head and shoulders without committing to specific features. These are everyman figures, representing not individuals, but the collective human presence. At this sacred site, the implications of this interpretation are profound. If these pillars represent stylized humans, then Göbekli Tepe becomes not just a temple, but a gathering place of stone ancestors, a permanent congregation of monumental figures who preside over the rituals and ceremonies that took place here. The living humans who came to this site would have found themselves in the company of these stone giants, participating in a communion that transcended the boundaries between the human and the divine. But the mystery deepens when you consider the arrangement of these pillars. They are not randomly placed, but carefully positioned in circles, with two particularly massive central pillars dominating each enclosure. These central pillars are often the largest and most elaborately decorated, suggesting that they held special significance in the overall design. They face each other across the circular space, creating a sense of dialogue or confrontation, as if frozen in some eternal conversation whose words we cannot hear. The positioning suggests hierarchy, with the central pillars serving as focal points around which the others are arranged. Some scholars have suggested that these represent shamans or priests, spiritual leaders who commanded special respect and authority. Others see them as representations of deities or ancestral spirits, supernatural beings who oversaw the activities of the living community. The craftsmanship required to create these pillars staggers the imagination. Each one had to be quarried from the living rock, shaped with primitive tools, and then somehow transported and erected without the aid of wheels, pulleys, or draft animals. The precision of the carving, the smoothness of the surfaces, the intricate details of the relief work, all speak of master craftsmen who had perfected their techniques over generations. But perhaps most remarkably, no two pillars are exactly alike. Each one bears its own unique combination of symbols and decorative elements, its own subtle variations in proportion and detail. This suggests that they were not mass-produced according to a standard template, but individually conceived and executed, each one a unique work of art created for a specific purpose within the overall design. The human elements carved into the pillars take on an almost ghostly quality in the changing light. As the sun moves across the sky, shadows shift and dance across the stone surfaces, sometimes emphasizing the carved arms and belts, sometimes obscuring them in mysterious darkness. It is as if the pillars themselves are alive, breathing with the rhythm of day and night, responding to the eternal cycle of light and shadow that has played across their surfaces for 11,000 years. Standing among these monumental figures, you cannot help but feel the presence of the builders themselves. They poured their vision, their beliefs, their understanding of the sacred into these stones, creating something that would outlast their own mortal lives by millennia. The pillars are their voices, speaking across the vast gulf of time in a language of stone and symbol that we are only beginning to understand. The faceless quality of the pillars adds to their power and mystery. Without individual features to distract us, we are free to project our own understanding onto these ancient forms. They become mirrors of our own humanity, reflecting back our deepest questions about identity, community, and the meaning of existence. They remind us that beneath the surface differences that divide us, we share a common heritage with the builders of Göbekli Tepe, a common need to create meaning from the raw materials of existence. As night falls over the site, the pillars seem to take on a life of their own, their massive forms silhouetted against the star-filled sky. In the darkness, they become more than stone, more than archaeological artifacts. They become witnesses to the eternal human struggle to understand our place in the cosmos, to create something lasting from our brief passage through time, to speak in stone what our voices cannot adequately express. The T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand as monuments to the power of human imagination and the enduring need to create sacred space. They remind us that our ancestors, even in their apparent simplicity, possessed a sophisticated understanding of symbolism, hierarchy, and the relationship between the human and the divine. In their silent presence, we find not just the remnants of an ancient temple, but a testament to the timeless human quest for meaning, beauty, and transcendence. In the gentle light of evening, as shadows begin to lengthen across the ancient site, the true artistry of Göbekli Tepe reveals itself. The massive pillars, impressive as they are in their stark simplicity, are only part of the story. It is in the intricate carvings that dance across their surfaces that we find the soul of this place, the dreams and fears and spiritual visions of people who lived 11,000 years ago. Run your fingers along the limestone surface of one of these pillars, and you will feel the texture of ancient artistry. Here a fox stalks across the stone, its form so lifelike that you can almost see it moving in the flickering shadows. There, a wild boar charges with tusks bared, frozen in eternal aggression. Serpents coil and writhe, their scales rendered with meticulous detail. Scorpions scuttle across the surface, their pincers raised as if ready to strike. These are not mere decorations, not simple ornamentation added to beautify the stone. These carvings speak of a profound connection between the human and animal worlds, an understanding of nature that goes far deeper than our modern, sanitized relationship with the creatures that share our planet. The artists who created these images lived in intimate contact with the wild, where the difference between predator and prey, between life and death, was a matter of daily survival. The technique itself is remarkable. Working with tools of flint and copper, these ancient craftsmen achieved a level of detail and artistic sophistication that rivals the work of any period in human history. The animals seem to emerge from the stone itself, as if the carvers were not creating but discovering forms that had always existed within the limestone, waiting to be revealed. Consider the symbolism embedded in these creatures. The fox, with its cunning intelligence and ability to move between worlds, may have represented the shamanic journey between the realm of the living and the realm of the spirits. The wild boar, fierce and unpredictable, might have symbolized. The raw power of nature, the untamed forces that early humans both feared and revered. The serpent, shedding its skin in eternal renewal, could have represented death and rebirth, the cyclical nature of existence that governed all life. But it is not just individual animals that tell the story. The way they are arranged on the pillars, the relationships between different species, the positioning of certain creatures in prominent locations, while others are relegated to less visible spaces. All of this speaks to a complex symbolic language that we are only beginning to decipher. On some pillars, predators and prey are carved in close proximity, suggesting perhaps a vision of cosmic balance, where death feeds life and life inevitably returns to death. On others, certain animals seem to be ascending or descending, moving between different levels of the pillar as if traveling between different realms of existence. A scorpion appears with particular frequency, its image repeated across multiple pillars and enclosures. In many ancient cultures, the scorpion was associated with death and transformation, its sting bringing an end that was also a beginning. Perhaps for the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the scorpion represented the necessary destruction that precedes renewal, a darkness that must be faced before the light can return. Birds, too, feature prominently in the carvings, their wings spread as if in flight, or their beaks open as if in song. In shamanic traditions across the world, birds are often seen as messengers between the earthly and celestial realms, their ability to fly making them natural symbols of transcendence and spiritual communication. The carved birds of Göbekli Tepe may have represented the prayers and offerings of the living, carrying messages to the gods or ancestors who dwelt in the sky. The artistry extends beyond individual animals to include abstract symbols whose meanings remain tantalizingly beyond our grasp. Geometric patterns, spirals, and combinations of lines and curves appear throughout the site, sometimes in isolation and sometimes in combination with animal forms. These may represent astronomical observations, recording the positions of stars and planets at significant times. They might be maps of the spiritual landscape, charts of the invisible geography that shamans navigated in their otherworldly journeys. What strikes you most powerfully about these carvings is their emotional resonance. Despite the 11,000 years that separate us from their creation, they speak to something universal in the human experience. The careful attention to detail, the obvious reverence for the creatures depicted, the sophisticated understanding of symbolism and narrative. All of this reveals minds that were as complex and thoughtful as our own. The process of creating these carvings would have been both physically demanding and spiritually significant. Each strike of the flint tool, each careful shaping of stone, would have been an act of meditation, a communion with the forces and creatures being depicted. The carvers were not just artists, but priests, not just craftsmen, but shamans, channeling the power of the animal world into permanent form. As you study these ancient images in the fading light, you begin to understand that Göbekli Tepe was not just a temple, but a library, a vast repository of knowledge about the natural world and humanity's place within it. The pillars served as stone books, their surfaces inscribed with the accumulated wisdom of generations. The stories they tell are not written in words, but in the universal language of image and symbol, speaking directly to the part of our consciousness that predates speech. The preservation of these carvings is itself miraculous. A deliberate burial of the site protected them from the weathering that has destroyed so many other ancient artworks. When the excavators first uncovered these pillars, the carvings were as crisp and clear as the day they were completed. Their details preserved in the limestone, like memories frozen in time. In the gathering darkness, the carved animals seemed to come alive, their stone forms animated by shadow and starlight. The ancient artists achieved a kind of immortality through their work, their vision surviving long after their bones have turned to dust. They speak to us across the millennia, reminding us that art is humanity's attempt to capture the eternal, to make permanent what is by nature temporary and fleeting. Carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand as testament to the power of human creativity to transform raw stone into living narrative. They remind us that our ancestors possessed not just the technical skills to create beauty, but the spiritual insight to understand that beauty itself is a form of prayer, a way of participating in the ongoing creation of the world. In their silent presence, we find not just archaeological artifacts, but windows into the soul of early humanity, revealing depths of thought and feeling that connect us across the vast expanse of time. As the night deepens over the ancient site, and the carved animals seem to stir in the starlight, we are drawn to contemplate perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Who were the people who conceived and built this extraordinary place? What manner of society could have organized such a monumental undertaking, and what drove them to invest such enormous effort in creating something so far beyond the apparent needs of mere survival? The conventional timeline of human development tells us that, in 9600 BCE, our ancestors lived in small nomadic bands, following the herds and the seasons, their lives consumed by the daily necessities of finding food, shelter, and safety. Had not yet learned to plant seeds or domesticate animals. They had not yet discovered the potter's wheel or the art of metalworking. They lived, we are told, in a state of perpetual struggle against the forces of nature, with little time or energy left over for the creation of art or the contemplation of the divine. Yet here stands Göbekli Tepe, a monument to the inadequacy of such simple explanations. The people who built this place were indeed hunter-gatherers, but they were something more as well. They were visionaries, architects, artists, and spiritual leaders whose achievements challenge our most basic assumptions about the progression of human civilization. Consider the logistics alone. The quarrying of the massive limestone blocks required not just physical strength, but sophisticated knowledge of stone and geology. The builders had to understand how to read the grain of the rock, how to split it cleanly, how to shape it without causing fractures that would ruin months of work. They needed specialized tools, techniques passed down through generations of master craftsmen. But quarrying was only the beginning. These massive pillars, some weighing as much as modern trucks, had to be transported from the quarry sites to their final positions. Without wheels, without beasts of burden, without pulleys or cranes, how did they accomplish this seemingly impossible task? The answer lies in the one resource they possessed in abundance: human cooperation on a scale previously unimaginable. Archaeological evidence suggests that the construction of Göbekli Tepe required the coordinated effort of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people working together over extended periods. This was not the work of a single tribe or clan, but of a confederation of groups who came together for a common purpose. The implications are staggering. These supposed primitive peoples possessed social and organizational skills that rival those of any civilization in history. But what brought them together? What shared vision or belief system could have inspired such unprecedented cooperation? The answer, perhaps, lies in the realm of the spiritual rather than the material. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have been united not by the need for food or territory, but by a shared understanding of the sacred, a common desire to create a place where the human and divine could meet. The evidence suggests that these were people who lived in intimate contact with the natural world, who understood the language of animals and seasons, who could read the messages written in the movements of the stars. They were shamans and seers, hunters and gatherers, but also philosophers and theologians who grappled with questions that continue to perplex us today. Who are we? Why are we here? What is our relationship to the cosmos? The sophistication of their symbolic language, evident in the carved pillars, reveals minds capable of abstract thought and complex communication. They developed systems of meaning that could be transmitted across generations, preserved in stone for posterity. They understood the power of ritual and ceremony to bind communities together, to create shared identity and purpose. These were not the brutish cavemen of popular imagination, but people whose intellectual and spiritual achievements were in many ways more remarkable than our own. They built not out of necessity, but out of vision, not for practical purposes, but for the elevation of the human spirit. They were the first architects of the sacred, the original builders of humanity's bridge to the divine. The seasonal nature of their gatherings at Göbekli Tepe suggests a sophisticated understanding of time and calendar, of the rhythms that govern both celestial and terrestrial cycles. They knew when to plant and when to harvest, when to migrate, and when to gather, when to celebrate, and when to mourn. Their lives were lived in harmony with forces larger than themselves, in recognition of their place within the greater web of existence. The builders came from across the region, traveling hundreds of miles to participate in the construction and ritual life of the site. They brought with them not just their labor, but their knowledge, their stories, their unique perspectives on the mysteries of existence. Göbekli Tepe became a melting pot of early human culture, a place where different traditions could meet and merge, where the accumulated wisdom of scattered peoples could be concentrated and preserved. The leadership required for such an undertaking suggests the emergence of individuals with extraordinary charisma and vision. These were not kings or emperors in the traditional sense, but spiritual leaders who could inspire others to transcend their immediate self-interest for the sake of something greater. They were the first priests, the original shamans, the founding fathers and mothers of organized religion. Yet for all their achievements, these remarkable people remain largely invisible to us. They left no written records, no portraits, no personal testimonies. Their voices come to us only through the stones they carved, the spaces they created, the vision they embedded in the landscape itself. They are the anonymous heroes of human history, the forgotten pioneers who took the first steps toward civilization. As we stand among their monuments in the gathering darkness, we can feel their presence like a whisper in the wind. They are the ones who first dared to dream of permanence, who first conceived of creating something that would outlast their own brief lives. They are the ancestors who gave us the template for all that followed, who showed us that humans are capable of achieving the seemingly impossible when united by a common vision. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were us, in our earliest and perhaps purest form. They were humanity awakening to its own potential, discovering its capacity for beauty, meaning, and transcendence. In their achievements, we see not just the origins of civilization, but the eternal human impulse to reach beyond the mundane toward something sacred, something eternal, something worthy of the incredible gift of consciousness itself. In the silence of the night, their legacy speaks to us across 11,000 years, reminding us that we are the inheritors of an ancient tradition of seeking, building, and dreaming. The stones they left behind are not just archaeological artifacts, but invitations to remember who we are and what we are capable of becoming. They are the first chapter in the ongoing story of humanity's quest to understand its place in the cosmos, a story that continues to unfold with each passing day. The wind across the Anatolian plateau carries more than just the scent of wild herbs tonight. It carries whispers of an ancient truth that has turned everything we thought we knew about human civilization on its head. Here, beneath the blanket of stars that once guided our ancestors, we must confront a revolutionary idea that emerged from the dust and stone of Göbekli Tepe. What if the sacred came before the practical? What if temples were built before the first grain was ever planted? For generations, archaeologists painted a neat picture of human progress. First came agriculture, they said. Then came surplus food. Then came leisure time. And finally, with full bellies and time to spare, came the luxury of religion and monumental architecture. It was a story that made perfect sense to our modern minds. accustomed as we are to building our spiritual lives upon the foundation of material security. But Göbekli Tepe refuses to fit into this comfortable narrative. Standing here on this windswept hill, we find ourselves face to face with massive stone circles that predate the agricultural revolution by at least 1,000 years. These towering T-shaped pillars, carved with such skill and devotion, were erected by people who had never planted a seed, never tended a field, never built a permanent village. They were hunter-gatherers, wandering the landscape in small bands, following the herds and the season's dot, and yet, somehow, they found the will, the vision, and the organizational power to create something that would challenge our understanding of human nature itself. How do we explain this? How do we reconcile the image of nomadic hunters with the reality of coordinated construction projects that must have required hundreds of people working together for decades? The answer, whispered by the stones themselves, is that we may have had it backwards all along. Perhaps it wasn't prosperity that created the need for temples. Perhaps it was the need for temples that created prosperity. Perhaps the sacred impulse, the yearning to touch something greater than ourselves, wasn't the final flowering of civilization, but its very first seed. Imagine, if you will, the landscape of southeastern Turkey 11,000 years ago. The last ice age had ended, and the climate was warming. The hills were rich with wild grains, the valleys teemed with game, and the hunter-gatherer groups that called this region home were living in what some scholars call the original affluent society. They worked, on average, only a few days, week to meet their needs. The rest of their time was their own. But what does a human being do with free time? What did our ancestors do when their immediate needs were met and their minds were free to wander? They looked up at the stars and wondered. They watched the cycles of life and death around them and sensed patterns deeper than survival. They felt the pull of mysteries that no amount of hunting or gathering could satisfy, and so they began to dream of something permanent, something that would outlast their brief lives and speak to future generations. They began to dream of Göbekli Tepe, but here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. These weren't people with kings or elaborate hierarchies. They were egalitarian societies, making decisions by consensus, sharing resources freely. Yet, somehow, they managed to coordinate the most ambitious construction project of their time. They quarried stones weighing 20 tons each. They carved them with intricate designs. They transported them across miles of rugged terrain. They erected them in perfect circles, aligned with celestial observations of stunning precision. How did they do it? The answer may lie in the very nature of religious experience itself. When people share a common vision of the sacred, they can accomplish things that would be impossible through force or economics alone. They can move mountains because they believe those mountains need to be moved. They can work together across tribal boundaries because they serve something greater than any single tribe. This is what Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who first understood Göbekli Tepe's significance, called the spiritual Big Bang. He believed that organized religion wasn't just present at the dawn of civilization. It was the force that lit the fuse. The need to create sacred space, to gather regularly for ritual and ceremony, to maintain and expand these holy places, gradually transformed human society from small, scattered bands into larger, more complex communities. Think about what this means. It suggests that the human impulse toward the sacred isn't something that emerges only after our practical needs are met. It suggests that the sacred is itself a practical need, as fundamental as food or shelter. It suggests that we are, in our very essence, beings who require meaning as much as we require calories. The evidence for this revolutionary idea is written in stone across the hilltop. The earliest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are not just the most elaborate, they're the most sophisticated. As time passed, the circles became smaller, the carvings less intricate, the construction less ambitious. This is the opposite of what we expect if religion were simply the product of increasing prosperity and leisure. Instead, it suggests that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were driven by a spiritual urgency that gradually diminished as their descendants became more settled and perhaps more practical. But what was this urgency? What did they see in the stars and stones that demanded such extraordinary effort? The answer may lie in the very nature of the transition they were living through. They were witnessing the end of one world and the beginning of another. The ice age was ending. The climate was changing. The animals they had hunted for millennia were disappearing. The plants they had gathered for generations were shifting their ranges. In times of great transition, human beings have always turned to the sacred for guidance and comfort. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was their way of creating stability in a world that was changing too fast to comprehend. Perhaps it was their way of ensuring that the knowledge and wisdom of their ancestors would survive the coming transformation. And perhaps, in their wisdom, they understood something that we're only beginning to rediscover. Perhaps they knew that the sacred isn't just the ornament of civilization, but its foundation. Perhaps they knew that before we can build lasting communities, we must first build lasting connections to something greater than ourselves, not the hunter-gatherers of Göbekli Tepe had plenty of game to hunt and wild grains to gather. They could have continued their nomadic ways indefinitely, but they chose instead to invest their time and energy in creating something permanent, something sacred, something that would draw people together across generations. And in making that choice, they may have invented civilization itself, not as a response to agricultural surplus, but as a response to spiritual necessity, not as a luxury afforded by material success, but as a requirement for human flourishing that transcends material concerns entirely. This is the whisper that carries on the wind tonight across the Anatolian plateau. This is the secret that Göbekli Tepe has been keeping for 11,000 years. We are not creatures who develop spiritual needs only after our physical needs are met. We are spiritual creatures from the very beginning, and it is our spiritual needs that drive us to create. The physical world we inhabit. The sacred comes first. Everything else follows. In the silence of this ancient place, where the stars shine down on stones that have witnessed the birth of human civilization, we can almost hear the footsteps of those first pilgrims walking across the landscape toward something they couldn't yet name, but knew they had to build. They were walking toward us, toward this moment when we would finally understand what they were trying to tell us. They were walking toward the truth that temples aren't built by civilizations. Civilizations are built by the need to create temples. The sacred doesn't emerge from the practical. The practical emerges from the sacred. And somewhere in the marriage of these two truths lies the secret not just of Göbekli Tepe, but of what it means to be human in a world that is always changing, always challenging us to reach beyond ourselves toward something eternal. The wind carries their whispers still, if we know how to listen. It carries the sound of the first prayers, the first songs, the first gathering of human voices raised together in acknowledgement of mystery. It carries the echo of the choice that made us who we are, the choice to build, not just for today, but for tomorrow, not just for ourselves, but for the sacred that lives within us all. The stars above Göbekli Tepe tonight shine with the same ancient light that witnessed humanity's first great transformation. Not the transformation from wild to domesticated, from nomadic to settled, but something far more profound and perhaps more troubling. It was here, among these towering stone circles, that human beings may have first divided themselves into those who dream and those who build, those who command and those who obey, those who lead and those who follow. For most of human history, we lived in small, egalitarian bands. Everyone was a hunter. Everyone was a gatherer. Everyone was equal. Decisions were made by consensus, Resources were shared freely, and leadership was temporary and task-specific. Archaeological evidence from around the world suggests that this was the natural human condition for tens of thousands of years. We were, as some scholars put it, fiercely egalitarian. But something changed here on this windswept hilltop, something that would echo through the millennia and shape the very structure of human society. In the massive stones of Göbekli Tepe, we can read the first chapter of a new story, the story of hierarchy, of specialization, of the division of human society into layers of power and responsibility that we still recognize today. Consider what it would have taken to build even a single one of these stone circles. The pillars themselves, carved from solid limestone, weigh between 10 and 20 tons each. They had to be quarried from the bedrock, shaped with precision, decorated with intricate carvings, and then transported across the landscape to their final positions. The circular walls that connect them required thousands of smaller stones, each one carefully selected and placed. The entire structure had to be planned with mathematical precision, aligned with celestial observations, and built to last for millennia. This was not a task for a small band of hunter-gatherers working together in their spare time. This was a massive undertaking that required coordination, planning, and specialization on a scale that had never been attempted before. And with that coordination came something new in human experience: the need for some people to make decisions that others would follow, the need for some people to possess knowledge that others did not, the need for some people to hold authority that others would respect. Scholars say the organization needed to build the 12,000-year-old temple may mark the beginnings of class society and patriarchy. Think about what this means. Somewhere in the planning stages of Göbekli Tepe, human beings crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. They created the first architects, the first project managers, the first skilled craftsmen, the first religious specialists. They created, in other words, the first social hierarchy. We can see evidence of this hierarchy written in the stones themselves. The quality of the carving varies dramatically from pillar to pillar, suggesting different levels of skill and training. Some carvings are masterful, executed with a precision and artistry that speaks of years of practice and natural talent. Others are crude, awkward, clearly the work of apprentices or less skilled workers. This suggests not just a division of labor, but a ranking of that labor, a recognition that some people were better at certain tasks than others. But the hierarchy goes deeper than just skill. The very conception of Göbekli Tepe required a kind of knowledge that was not democratically distributed. Someone had to understand the movements of the stars well enough to align the circles with celestial events. Someone had to know the properties of stone well enough to select the right limestone or carving. Someone had to understand the principles of engineering well enough to ensure that 20-ton pillars would stand upright for millennia. Someone had to possess the vision to see, in their mind's eye, what the finished temple would look like and how it would function. This was specialized knowledge, and specialized knowledge means specialized power. The person who could read the stars became the astronomer priest. The person who could shape stone became the master craftsman. The person who could organize labor became the project leader. And with these roles came status, respect, and authority that their peers did not possess. This level of division of labor and shared purpose suggests that early societies were capable of far more than small, loosely organized bands. But it also suggests something that makes many of us uncomfortable: that complex human achievements may require complex human hierarchies. That the price of building something that lasts for millennia may be the creation of social structures that divide us into rulers and ruled, masters and apprentices, visionaries and laborers. The evidence suggests that this hierarchy was not imposed from above by force or violence. There are no signs of warfare at Göbekli Tepe, no weapons, no fortifications, no evidence of coercion. Instead, Göbekli Tepe society was a classless society, but a hierarchical society based on status. The hierarchy seems to have emerged organically from the practical needs of the project itself. People accepted different roles because those roles were necessary, and they accepted the authority of those with specialized knowledge because that authority was earned through demonstrated competence. This was what sociologists call a status society rather than a class society. Status based on what you could do, not on what you owned. Authority based on knowledge and skill, not on wealth or birth. It was a more fluid, more meritocratic kind of hierarchy than what would come later. But it was hierarchy nonetheless. And once that hierarchy was established, it began to shape everything else. The master craftsmen passed their knowledge to selected apprentices, creating lineages of skill that persisted across generations. The astronomer priests developed increasingly complex rituals and ceremonies that only they could perform. The project leaders accumulated social capital that extended beyond the construction site itself. We can see this process playing out in the archaeology. The earliest circles at Göbekli Tepe are not just the largest and most elaborate, they're also the most uniform in their construction. This suggests a tightly controlled building process, with clear standards and a clear chain of command. But as time passed, the circles became more varied, more individualistic, suggesting that different groups or different leaders were putting their own stamp on the construction. Perhaps most tellingly, we begin to see evidence of what archaeologists call competitive display. Later circles seem designed not just to serve their ritual function, but to outdo earlier ones in size, complexity, or artistic achievement. This is the signature of a hierarchical society, the need to demonstrate status through conspicuous construction, the drive to build something bigger and better than what came before. But what kind of people were these early leaders? What motivated them to take on the enormous responsibility of organizing such projects? The answer may lie in the very nature of the work they were doing. They were not building palaces for their own glory or fortresses for their own protection. They were building sacred spaces for their entire community. They were creating something that would serve not just their own generation, but generations yet unborn. This suggests a particular kind of leader, someone motivated not by personal aggrandizement, but by a sense of sacred duty. Someone who understood that their own temporary authority was justified only by the permanent benefit it would bring to their people. Someone who saw themselves not as rulers, but as servants of something greater than themselves. And perhaps this is why the hierarchy of Göbekli Tepe was accepted rather than resisted. It was not a hierarchy of exploitation, but of service. Not a hierarchy of oppression, but of expertise. Not a hierarchy that divided the community, but one that unified it around a common purpose that transcended individual ambition. But as we stand here tonight among these ancient stones, we must also confront the darker implications of what we're seeing. Once human beings learned to accept hierarchy in the service of the sacred, it became easier to accept hierarchy in the service of the practical. Once we learned to follow those with specialized knowledge, it became easier to follow those with specialized power. Once we learned to divide ourselves into those who think and those who work, it became easier to divide ourselves into those who rule and those who obey. The line that connects the master craftsmen of Göbekli Tepe to the pharaohs of Egypt, the astronomer priests of Anatolia to the god kings of Mesopotamia, is neither straight nor simple, but it is real. In creating the first hierarchy, the builders of Göbekli Tepe opened a door that could never be fully closed again. They discovered that human beings could accomplish amazing things when they worked together under organized leadership. But they also discovered that organized leadership inevitably creates organized inequality. This is perhaps the most profound mystery of Göbekli Tepe, not just how hunter-gatherers built such an extraordinary monument, but why they were willing to pay the social price that building it required, why they were willing to give up the fierce equality that had defined human society for millennia, in order to create something that would outlast them all. The answer whispers in the wind tonight. Across these ancient stones, they were willing to pay that price because they understood something that we're still learning, that some things are worth more than individual equality, that some achievements require collective sacrifice, that some dreams can only be realized when people are willing to accept different roles in service of a common vision. Whether that trade-off was worth it remains one of the great questions of human history. But here, among the first temples built by the first hierarchies, we can at least understand why our ancestors made the choice they did. They chose to build something eternal, even if it meant creating something that would divide them forever. The stars above us tonight shine on the birthplace of both our greatest achievements and our deepest divisions. In the stones of Göbekli Tepe, we can read the first chapter of the story that has shaped human civilization ever since. The story of what we can accomplish when we work together, and what we must sacrifice to make that work possible. The wind carries whispers across the ancient stones tonight, and if we listen carefully, we might hear the echoes of voices that have been silent for 11,000 years. Voices raised in ritual and ceremony, in the sacred acts that drew our ancestors to this remote hilltop generation after generation. What did they do here, these ancient pilgrims who carved massive stones and aligned them with the stars? What rituals unfolded in these circles that were so compelling, so vital, that people traveled hundreds of miles to participate in them? The answers lie scattered like fragments of bone across the archaeological record, pieces of a puzzle that archaeologists are still working to assemble. But from these fragments, a picture is beginning to emerge of rituals so ancient, so primal, that they may have formed the very foundation of human religious experience. Let us begin with what we know for certain. Archaeological evidence reveals large-scale hunting of gazelle between midsummer and autumn, suggesting that Göbekli may have been a seasonal gathering place, a destination for communities that converged here during specific times of the year. The impressive numbers of animal bones, particularly gazelle and aurochs, along with evidence of flint artifacts and stone vessels, support this interpretation. Picture, if you will, the approach of autumn 11,000 years ago. Across the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, small bands of hunter-gatherers begin their annual pilgrimage toward the sacred mountain. They carry with them not just the tools of daily survival, but the tools of ritual: carved stone vessels, flint knives, sharpened to perfection, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge of ceremonies passed down through generations of oral tradition. As they crest the final ridge and see the stone circles rising from the hilltop, what must they have felt? The same mixture of awe and anticipation that draws pilgrims to sacred sites today. For this was no ordinary gathering place. This was where the boundary between the human world and the divine world grew thin, where the living could commune with forces beyond their understanding. The rituals that unfolded here seemed to have centered around the great feast, the communal banquet that brought together people from vast distances. Evidence suggests a giant barbecue with beer as a rare ceremonial treat, painting a picture of elaborate communal meals that were as much about spiritual communion as physical nourishment. But these were not simple social gatherings. They were sacred feasts charged with meaning and purpose. The preparation alone would have been a ritual in itself. The hunting of the gazelle and aurochs, the careful selection of the finest animals, the gathering of wild grains for the precious beer that would accompany the feast. Every step would have been conducted according to ancient protocols, with specific prayers and ceremonies, marking each phase of the preparation. And then there were the bones. Thousands upon thousands of animal bones have been found at Göbekli Tepe, but they tell a story that goes far beyond simple consumption. Many of these bones show signs of careful processing, of intentional breaking and arrangement. Some appear to have been deliberately placed in specific patterns, as if they were part of elaborate ritual displays. But perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from the human remains themselves. Fragments of human skulls recovered during excavations show deep grooves carved into the crania using flint tools, providing evidence of a previously unknown variation of death ritual from this 11,000-year-old site. Researchers believe this may be evidence of one of the earliest skull cults, with some skull pieces showing lines cut into them. This discovery opens a window into rituals that must have been both terrifying and transcendent. Imagine the ceremonies that surrounded the processing of these skulls. The careful removal of flesh, the precise carving of grooves into the bone, the transformation of the dead into sacred objects. This was not mere burial of the deceased, but their elevation into the realm of the divine. The skull cult practices suggest that death was not seen as an ending, but as a transformation, a passage from one form of existence to another. The carved skulls may have served as intermediaries between the living and the dead, objects through which the ancestors could continue to participate in the rituals of their descendants. But the rituals at Göbekli Tepe were not confined to the realm of death. A growing body of evidence suggests that the site may have had an astronomical function, with scholars arguing that it was aligned with celestial bodies, allowing its builders to track seasonal changes or mark significant events such as solstices and equinoxes. Research demonstrates how secret society esoterica roots from astronomical monitoring and associated ritual observances, with core members being star watchers. This astronomical dimension adds another layer to our understanding of the rituals performed. Here, the great stone circles were not just gathering places but cosmic calendars, instruments for marking the passage of time and the cycles of the heavens. The ceremonies conducted here would have been timed to celestial events, with the solstices and equinoxes serving as anchor points for the ritual year. Recent research suggests that the carvings at Göbekli Tepe may represent the world's oldest solar calendar, with some scholars proposing that ancient people created these carvings to record the date a swarm of comet fragments hit Earth nearly 13,000 years ago. If this interpretation is correct, then the rituals performed here were not just about marking time, but about commemorating cosmic catastrophes, about preserving the memory of events that shaped the world itself. Picture the scene as the sun sets. On the autumn equinox, 11,000 years ago, the stone circles are filled with people, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of ritual fires. The carved skulls of the ancestors are arranged in places of honor, their hollow sockets, seeming to watch over the proceedings. The great feast has been consumed, the ceremonial beer has been shared, and now the most sacred part of the ritual begins. As the last light fades from the sky, the star watchers among the assembled crowd begin to point toward specific constellations, calling out their names and their meanings. The pillars themselves seem to come alive in the dancing firelight, their carved animals appearing to move and breathe. The boundary between the human world and the spirit world dissolves, and for a few precious hours, the living and the dead, the earthly and the divine, are united in sacred communion. But what was the ultimate purpose of these rituals? What drove people to travel so far, to invest so much time and energy, to participate in ceremonies that must have been both physically demanding and emotionally overwhelming? The answer may lie in the very nature of the transition that these people were living through. They were witnesses to the end of the Ice Age, to the transformation of their world from a cold, harsh landscape to the warmer, more fertile environment that would eventually give birth to agriculture. They were living through one of the most dramatic periods of environmental change in human history, and they needed rituals that would help them make sense of these transformations. The ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe may have been their way of ensuring that the knowledge and wisdom of their ancestors would survive the coming changes. The skull cult practices ensured that the dead remained present among the living. The astronomical observations ensured that the movements of the heavens would continue to be understood and predicted. The great feasts ensured that the bonds between distant communities would remain strong even as the world around them changed. The monumental architecture and symbolic carvings point to a place of communal gathering for rituals or feasts, with the lack of domestic remains strongly supporting the theory that this was a place of temporary ceremonial occupation. Some researchers conclude that Göbekli Tepe may have been a pilgrimage site, where people from surrounding areas gathered for religious ceremonies and communal events, and so the rituals served multiple purposes. They preserved ancient knowledge. They strengthened social bonds. They provided a framework for understanding cosmic events, and they offered a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They were, in essence, the foundation upon which all subsequent religious experience would be built. As we stand here tonight among these ancient stones, we can almost feel the presence of those ancient ritualists, their voices rising in songs, whose words we will never know, their hands moving in gestures whose meanings we can only guess. But we can feel the power of what they created, the sacred space that they consecrated with their presence and their prayers. The rituals of Göbekli Tepe may be lost to time, but their echoes still resonate in the stones themselves. They remind us that human beings have always been creatures of ceremony, beings who need ritual and meaning as much as we need food and shelter. They remind us that the sacred is not something that emerged late in human history, but something that has been with us from the very beginning, calling us to gather together, to reach beyond ourselves, to touch the divine dot in the silence of this ancient place. We can hear those echoes still, carrying across the centuries the whispered promises of transcendence, the ancient songs of transformation, the eternal human quest to find meaning in the midst of mystery. The rituals may be forgotten, but the longing that created them lives on, as present in our hearts today as it was in the hearts of those who first raised these stones toward the stars. The moon rises high over the Anatolian plateau tonight, casting long shadows across the ancient stones of Göbekli Tepe. We've walked together through nearly 2 hours of mysteries, traced the fingers of time across weathered pillars, and listened to the whispers of our earliest ancestors. Now we come to perhaps the most puzzling chapter of all. Why did the people who built this sacred place choose to bury it beneath tons of earth and stone? Imagine, if you will, a gentle summer evening 11,000 years ago. The sun sets slowly behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Around the great stone circles of Göbekli Tepe, people gather as they have for countless generations. But tonight is different. Tonight, they carry baskets of earth and stones, tools worn smooth by use, and heavy hearts filled with purpose. This is not destruction. This is not abandonment. This is something far more profound, a deliberate act of preservation, a sacred burial that would keep their temple safe for millennia to come. The evidence speaks softly but clearly across the centuries. Recent archaeological analysis suggests that while some of the burial may have resulted from natural processes like building collapse and erosion, there are strong indications of intentional, ritually charged burial of the structures. Layer upon layer of carefully placed fill, mixed with fragments of bone and stone, tells us that this was no accident of time or weather. Picture the scene. Families who have known these stones since childhood, artisans who carved the great pillars with their own hands, spiritual leaders who conducted ceremonies beneath the watchful eyes of the stone animals. They move with quiet reverence, each basket of earth a prayer, each stone a blessing. The great T-shaped pillars, those silent guardians we've come to know so well, slowly disappear beneath the growing mounds of earth. But why? What could compel people to bury their most sacred creation? The answer like so many at Göbekli Tepe, lies not in certainty, but in the realm of gentle possibility. Perhaps they understood something we are only beginning to grasp, that some things are too precious to leave exposed to the ravages of time and change. Perhaps they knew that the world was shifting around them, that the age of the hunter-gatherers was giving way to something new, and they wanted to preserve their temple for a future they could barely imagine. Think of it as an act of profound love, the way a parent might carefully wrap a treasured family heirloom and place it in safekeeping. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not destroying their creation. They were entrusting it to the earth, the same earth that had provided the stone, the same earth that would nurture the seeds of agriculture that would soon transform human civilization. There's something deeply moving about this act of burial. In our modern world, we often think of preservation in terms of museums and protective structures, climate control and security systems. But these ancient people understood preservation differently. They knew that sometimes the greatest act of love is to let something go, to trust it to forces greater than ourselves. Scholars speculate this act may have been a form of ritual closure, or an effort to preserve the sacred site for posterity. Unlike most ancient ruins, Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned to decay, but purposefully sealed, adding yet another layer to its enigmatic story. The process was not rushed. Archaeological evidence suggests it took place over many years, perhaps even generations. Picture the older members of the community, those who remembered when the great pillars were first raised, working alongside young people who would carry the memory of this sacred act into the future. Children would have helped, their small hands adding pebbles to the growing mound, learning without words about the cycle of creation and preservation, revelation and concealment. As the stones disappeared beneath the earth, the memories would not have faded. Stories would have been told around fires, passed from grandmother to grandchild, from teacher to student. The location would have been remembered, marked perhaps by smaller stones, visited on special occasions, when the thin veil between past and present grew thinner still. And so Göbekli Tepe slept, patient as the earth itself. Seasons turned to years to centuries, centuries to millennia. The mound grew higher as wind and rain added their own layers. Grass sprouted, trees took root, and the hill began to look like any other gentle rise in the landscape. Only the stones knew what lay beneath. Only the earth held the secret of the buried temple. But secrets, like seeds, have a way of working their way back to the surface when the time is right. The ancient people who buried Göbekli Tepe could not have imagined that their careful preservation would be discovered by archaeologists with tools and techniques beyond their wildest dreams. They could not have foreseen that their buried temple would speak to a world connected by invisible threads of communication, that their stone animals would look out upon visitors from every corner of the earth. Perhaps that was their intention all along. Perhaps they buried their temple not to hide it, but to ensure it would be found at precisely the right moment in human history. Perhaps they understood that future generations would need to rediscover this ancient wisdom, this reminder of what we once were and what we might become again. The act of burial itself tells us something profound about these ancient people. They were not primitive in their thinking, not bound by the short-term perspectives we often associate with early humans. They were thinking in terms of deep time, of preservation across millennia, of gifts to generations yet unborn. They understood that some things are too important to leave to chance. In the gentle darkness of the Anatolian night, as the last baskets of earth were emptied and the final stones were placed, the people of Göbekli Tepe would have stood in silence, saying goodbye to their temple. But it was not a goodbye forever. It was a goodbye until the world was ready to listen to what the stones had to say. Following the initial observations about the intentional burial of Göbekli Tepe, evidence from affiliated sites, such as Karahan Tepe, indicates that they too were intentionally buried. Such purposeful burial, it would seem, was a widespread phenomenon. This practice of sacred burial was not unique to Göbekli Tepe. Across the region, other ancient sites show similar patterns of careful interment. It was as if an entire civilization had made a collective decision to preserve their most precious creations by entrusting them to the earth. They were creating a gift for the future, a time capsule written in stone and soil. The wisdom of this decision becomes clearer when we consider how many ancient sites have been lost to weather, war, and the simple passage of time. The great stones of Göbekli Tepe might have been quarried away by later builders, might have fallen to earthquakes or been worn smooth by wind and rain. But protected beneath their blanket of earth, they remained perfect, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And when that moment came, when Klaus Schmidt first glimpsed the carved head of a stone animal poking through the soil, it was as if the ancient people themselves were reaching across the centuries to tap him on the shoulder and say, now is the time to remember. The burial of Göbekli Tepe was not an ending but a transformation. The temple did not disappear. It changed from a place of active worship to a place of patient waiting. The stones did not lose their power. They stored it, accumulated it, concentrated it through the long millennia of darkness and silence. This understanding changes how we think about preservation and memory. These ancient people were not just building monuments for themselves. They were building for us, for all the generations that would come after. They were creating a dialogue across time, a conversation between the deep past and the uncertain future. As we near the end of our journey through Göbekli Tepe's mysteries, we can almost hear the ancient voices whispering in the wind. We built this for you. We preserved this for you. We trusted the earth to keep our secret until you were ready to understand. The intentional burial of Göbekli Tepe stands as perhaps the most profound act of faith in human history. It was faith in the future, faith in the earth itself, faith in the enduring power of sacred places to speak to the human heart across any distance of time or space. This understanding changes how we think about preservation and memory. These ancient people were not just building monuments for themselves. They were building for us, for all the generations that would come after. They were creating a dialogue across time, a conversation between the deep past and the uncertain future. As we near the end of our journey through Göbekli Tepe's mysteries, we can almost hear the ancient voices whispering in the wind. We built this for you. We preserved this for you. We trusted the earth to keep our secret until you are ready to understand. The intentional burial of Göbekli Tepe stands as perhaps the most profound act of faith in human history. It was faith in the future, faith in the earth itself, faith in the enduring power of sacred places to speak to the human heart across any distance of time or space. Tonight, as we prepare to close this chapter of our story, we can feel the weight of that faith, the responsibility it places on us as inheritors of this ancient gift. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe gave us more than stones and carvings. They gave us a lesson in how to think beyond our own lifetimes, how to plant seeds that will flower in gardens we will never see. In the quiet darkness of sleep, we carry their wisdom with us. We understand now that some things are too precious to leave exposed, that preservation sometimes requires concealment, that the greatest gifts are often the ones we save for those who will come after us. The stones of Göbekli Tepe sleep again in the Anatolian night, but they are no longer buried. They stand revealed, sharing their secrets with anyone who takes the time to listen. They remind us that we too are part of a great continuity, that we too have the power to preserve and protect, to create and conceal, to build monuments of love that will outlast our own brief time on earth. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the hills of Turkey, ancient stones keep their vigil, holding the memories of our species' earliest spiritual awakening. They have waited 11,000 years, to tell their story. They can wait a little longer while we sleep, while we dream of the mysterious people who built them, buried them, and trusted them to the future. The burial of Göbekli Tepe was not an ending but a beginning, the start of a conversation that continues to this very moment, in the quiet space between sleeping and waking, between ancient wisdom and modern understanding, between the stones that remember and the hearts that still seek to understand why we build, why we preserve, and why. We trust in the power of sacred places to speak across the vastness of time. In the gentle quiet of this late evening, as we draw near the end of our journey through the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, we find ourselves at the threshold of perhaps the most profound question of all. What happens when the distant past touches the deepest parts of our collective memory? What occurs when archaeological discovery meets the stories we've carried in our hearts for thousands of years? The wind whispers softly across the Anatolian hills tonight, carrying with it echoes of something far older than recorded history, yet somehow familiar. It's the sound of recognition, the gentle stirring of memories that seem to belong not just to individuals, but to our entire species. These are the memories that live in our myths, our legends, our most sacred stories about where we came from and how we began. When Klaus Schmidt first uncovered the great stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe, he unleashed more than archaeological evidence. He awakened something that had been sleeping in the collective unconscious of humanity, the memory of a golden age, a time when the world was different, when the relationship between heaven and earth was more intimate, when sacred places held the power to connect us to something greater than ourselves. The stones of Göbekli Tepe don't just speak to archaeologists and historians. They whisper to the part of us that remembers Eden, that dreams of paradise lost, that carries within its heart the story of a time when humanity lived closer to the divine. These are not merely academic connections. They are the stirrings of ancestral memory, the recognition that comes when we encounter something our souls have been waiting to find. Consider the parallels that emerge like flowers in the dawn light. The fact that Göbekli Tepe predated the advent of agriculture and permanent settlements aligned with the biblical account of the Garden of Eden as a pre-agricultural paradise. Here was a sacred place that existed before the world as we know it began, before the great transition from hunting and gathering to farming in cities, before the fundamental shift that would define human civilization. The location itself carries symbolic weight. High on its hill, surrounded by the rolling landscape of southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe occupies a place that would have been visible for miles in every direction. It was a beacon, a gathering point, a place where earth touched sky. In the soft light of evening, one can almost see why ancient people would have chosen this spot as the dwelling place of the sacred, the intersection of human and divine. But we must tread carefully here, with the respect that both archaeology and mythology deserve. While certainly Göbekli Tepe lies in a chain of hills north of the Haran Plain, the scene of numerous biblical narratives, we cannot simply overlay one story upon another without acknowledging the complexity of both. The stones themselves tell their own story, and we must listen to them on their own terms. Even as we recognize the resonances with the stories we carry in our collective memory, what emerges is not identification, but recognition. Not proof, but poetry. Not historical fact, but mythical truth. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were creating something that would speak to the deepest parts of human experience, something that would resonate across the millennia with our most fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and connection to the sacred. Think of the Garden of Eden, not as a specific place, but as a universal human memory of a time when the world was whole, when humanity lived in harmony with the natural and spiritual realms. In this light, Göbekli Tepe becomes one of many places where this memory was given form, where the longing for paradise was expressed in stone and ritual, where the desire for connection with the divine was made manifest in architecture and art. The story of the Tower of Babel, too, finds echoes in these ancient stones. The Tower of Babel is a type of myth known as an etiology, which is intended to explain the origin of a custom, ritual, geographical feature, name, or other phenomenon. In the biblical narrative, humanity comes together to build a tower that reaches toward heaven, driven by the desire to make a name for themselves and to avoid being scattered across the earth at Göbekli Tepe. We see a similar impulse made manifest, the gathering of people from across the region, the coordinated effort to build something that reached toward the sky, the creation of a place that would serve as a focal point for human community and spiritual aspiration. The great T-shaped pillars, standing like silent sentinels, seem to embody this reaching toward transcendence, this desire to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. But where the Tower of Babel story speaks of divine intervention and scattering, Göbekli Tepe tells a different tale. Here, the scattering seems to have been chosen by the builders themselves. They buried their creation, scattered its secrets beneath the earth, and moved on to create a new kind of civilization. Perhaps they understood something that the builders of Babel did not, that some things are too sacred to be grasped, too precious to be possessed, too profound to be made permanent. The flood stories that appear in cultures around the world may also find their echo in the layers of Göbekli Tepe, not a literal flood of water, but the flood of change that swept over humanity during the transition from the hunter-gatherer way of life to agricultural civilization. A careful burial of the site speaks of a world ending, a way of life being washed away by the inexorable tide of human development, in the gentle darkness of the Anatolian night. As we contemplate these connections, we begin to understand that Göbekli Tepe is not just an archaeological site, but a keeper of memories, a guardian of stories that have been trying to tell themselves for 11,000 years. The stones hold within them the echo of humanity's first great spiritual awakening, the memory of a time when the sacred was not separate from the everyday, when the act of building was itself a form of prayer. These connections between Göbekli Tepe and our mythological heritage suggest something profound about the nature of human memory itself. Perhaps the stories we tell about paradise and towers and floods are not just imaginative creations, but dim recollections of actual experiences, cultural memories passed down through countless generations until they became the myths that shape our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The collective memory of humanity is like a vast library, and Göbekli Tepe is one of its most precious manuscripts. Written in stone rather than words, preserved by burial rather than bookbinding. It tells the story of our species' first encounter with the numinous, our earliest attempt to create something that would outlast the brief span of individual lives, and connect us to something eternal. As we rest in the quiet of this evening, we can feel the weight of that connection. We are not just modern people looking back at an ancient site. We are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back to the very beginning of human consciousness. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were our ancestors in the deepest sense, not just biologically, but spiritually, culturally, mythologically. Their dreams have become our dreams. Their questions have become our questions. Their longing for the sacred has become our longing for the sacred. Across the vast expanse of time that separates us from them, we recognize in their work the same impulses that drive us today, the desire to create meaning, to build something beautiful, to reach toward transcendence. The stones of Göbekli Tepe stand as a bridge between the mythological past and the archaeological present, between the stories we tell and the evidence we uncover, between the dreams of our ancestors and the realities of our own time. They remind us that we are part of a story much larger than ourselves, a narrative that began in the mists of prehistory and continues to unfold in every generation. In the soft silence of sleep, we carry this understanding with us. We are not isolated individuals living in a disconnected present, but links in a chain of memory that stretches back to the first humans who looked up at the stars and wondered what it all meant. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were asking the same questions we ask today, seeking the same connections we seek today, dreaming the same dreams we dream today. Their temple has become our temple. Their story has become our story. Their memory has become our memory. In recognizing the echoes of Eden and Babel and the flood in these ancient stones, we recognize ourselves, our deepest longings, our most profound questions about the nature of existence and our place in the cosmos. The collective memory of humanity is not a burden but a gift, not a weight but a source of strength. It connects us to something larger than ourselves, something that transcends the boundaries of individual experience and cultural difference. In the stones of Göbekli Tepe, we find evidence of that connection, proof that the longing for the sacred is not a recent invention, but an ancient inheritance, not a modern construct, but a primal truth. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of this great continuity, this ancient conversation between human consciousness and the mystery of existence. The stones of Göbekli Tepe keep their vigil in the Turkish hills, holding within them the memories of our species' first great spiritual awakening, waiting for each new generation to rediscover the truths they have been preserving for 11,000 years. In your dreams tonight, you may find yourself walking among those ancient pillars, feeling the weight of the stories they carry, understanding without words the connection between the mythological past and the archaeological present. You are not just a visitor to this ancient site, but a participant in the ongoing story it tells, a keeper of the memories it preserves, a bridge between the ancient longing for the sacred and the modern search for meaning. The collective memory of humanity lives on in places like Göbekli Tepe, in the recognition that stirs within us when we encounter something that speaks to the deepest parts of our being. We are all descendants of the builders of that first temple, all inheritors of their dreams, all participants in the great human project of reaching toward transcendence through the creation of sacred spaces and sacred stories, the ancient stones. Remember, and through them, we remember too. We remember who we were, who we are, and who we might yet become. In the gentle darkness of the Anatolian night, the memory of paradise stirs once more, calling us home to the sacred places within, ourselves, to the eternal stories that shape our understanding of what it means to be human. The moon has traveled far across the Anatolian sky as we've journeyed together through the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe. 2 hours have passed like whispers in the wind, carrying us from the moment of discovery to the depths of meaning, from the odd puzzles of archaeology to the poetry of the human spirit. Now, as our story draws to its gentle close, we find ourselves standing once more among those ancient pillars, listening to what they have been trying to tell us all along. The night air is soft and still around the great stone circles. The carved animals seem to stir in the moonlight, their ancient eyes reflecting something that goes beyond the physical world into the realm of pure understanding. The T-shaped pillars stand like patient teachers, having waited 11,000 years for us to learn how to truly listen to what they have to say. What have we learned in our journey through this sacred landscape? What wisdom have the stones shared with us in the quiet hours of the night? Perhaps most importantly, we have learned that listening is not just about hearing words or processing information, but about opening ourselves to truths that transcend the boundaries of time and culture, logic and language. The stones of Göbekli Tepe speak in a language older than words, a vocabulary of symbol and form, of sacred geometry and spiritual aspiration. They tell us that the human desire for transcendence is not a modern invention, but an ancient inheritance, not a sophisticated development, but a primal truth that has been with us since the very beginning of consciousness itself. When we first encountered these mysterious pillars, we approached them with the tools of modern archaeology, the methods of scientific inquiry, the assumptions of contemporary understanding. But as we spent time in their presence, something shifted. We began to realize that some truths cannot be excavated with brushes and trowels, cannot be carbon dated or cataloged, cannot be fully understood through analysis alone, not the builders. Of Göbekli Tepe were not primitive people stumbling toward civilization. They were sophisticated spiritual architects, visionaries, who understood something about the nature of the sacred that we are only beginning to rediscover. They knew that certain places on earth hold a special power, that certain arrangements of stone and space can create openings between the everyday world and the realm of the eternal dot. In the gentle darkness of the Turkish night, we can feel the presence of those ancient builders. They are not ghosts or spirits, but living influences whose vision continues to shape our understanding of what it means to be human. They speak to us through the stones they carved, the circles they created, the sacred spaces they preserved. For us across the vast expanse of time, their message is simple yet profound. You are not alone. You are part of a great continuity of consciousness that stretches back to the very beginning of human awareness. The questions you ask have been asked before. The longings you feel have been felt before. The sacred places you seek have been sought before. You are walking in the footsteps of pilgrims who began their journey 11,000 years ago. The stones remind us that we are not the first generation to wonder about our place in the cosmos, to seek meaning in the midst of mystery, to build monuments to our highest aspirations. The people who created Göbekli Tepe were asking the same fundamental questions that occupy us today. Who are we? Where do we come from? What is our purpose? How do we connect with something greater than ourselves? Their answers, carved in stone and preserved in earth, speak to us across the millennia. They tell us that the search for the sacred is not a luxury, but a necessity, not an optional add-on to human existence, but the very foundation of what makes us human. They remind us that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, not merely biological entities struggling for survival. As we prepare to leave this ancient sanctuary, we carry with us the understanding that Göbekli Tepe is not just a monument to the past, but a message to the future. It is a reminder that we too are ancestors in the making, that our actions and choices will ripple forward through time, influencing generations yet to be born. The stones ask us what we will build, what we will preserve, what we will leave behind. For those who come after us, the great T-shaped pillars stand as eternal question marks, inviting each generation to discover their own answers to the mysteries of existence. They do not provide easy solutions or simple explanations, but rather create a space for contemplation, a sanctuary for the soul, a place where the eternal dialogue between human consciousness and the great mystery can continue. In the quiet moments before sleep, we can feel the weight of this inheritance. We are not just passive observers of ancient history, but active participants in an ongoing story, a narrative that began with the first humans who looked up at the stars and wondered what it all meant. The stones of Göbekli Tepe have been waiting for us, holding their secrets, preserving their wisdom, trusting that eventually we would learn how to listen. The act of listening, we have discovered, is itself a form of prayer, a way of opening ourselves to truths that exist beyond the boundaries of individual understanding. When we truly listen to the stones, we hear not just information about the past, but guidance for the present, not just facts about ancient peoples, but insights into our own deepest nature. The animals carved on the pillars become our teachers, reminding us of our connection to the natural world, our place in the great web of life. The serpent speaks of transformation and renewal, the lion of courage and strength, the boar of wildness and authenticity, the vulture of death and rebirth. Each creature carries a message. Each symbol holds a key to understanding the complex relationship between the human and the sacred. The circles themselves become mandalas of meaning, sacred geometries that map the relationship between the individual and the cosmic, the finite and the infinite, the known and the unknowable. Standing within these stone circles, we feel ourselves at the center of a vast conversation between earth and sky, between the material and the spiritual, between the ancient and the eternal dot. As the night deepens around us, we understand that our journey through Göbekli Tepe has been more than an exploration of archaeological mysteries. It has been a pilgrimage of the spirit, a quest for understanding that has taken us not just backward in time, but inward to the deepest places of the human heart. We have not just learned about ancient people, but discovered something essential about ourselves. The stones have taught us that the sacred is not something we need to seek in distant places or future times, but something that is always present, always available, always waiting for us to open our hearts and minds to its presence. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that every place can be a sacred place. Every moment can be a sacred moment. Every encounter can be a sacred encounter if we approach it with the right spirit of openness and reverence. The ancient builders understood something that we often forget in our hurried modern lives, that the act of creation itself is a form of worship, a way of participating in the ongoing evolution of consciousness, a method of contributing to the great human project of making meaning from mystery. When they carved those stones, they were not just creating artifacts, but performing acts of devotion, not just building monuments, but offering prayers in granite and limestone. Their temple has become our temple. Their vision has become our vision. Their prayer has become our prayer. In recognizing the sacred in these ancient stones, we recognize the sacred in ourselves, in our own capacity for wonder, for reverence, for the creation of beauty and meaning in the midst of uncertainty and change. The night wind carries the whispers of those ancient voices, reminding us that we are not tourists in this sacred landscape, but inheritors of a tradition that stretches back to the very beginning of human consciousness. We are the latest chapter in a story that began when the first humans felt the stirring of the sacred within themselves and decided to give it form in stone and ritual, in symbol and ceremony. As we prepare to rest, we carry with us the knowledge that Göbekli Tepe is not just a place but a state of consciousness, not just a monument but a method of understanding, not just an ancient site but a living presence that continues to speak to anyone who takes the time to listen. The stones have not finished their conversation with humanity. They have only just begun. In the quiet hours before dawn, as we drift towards sleep, we can feel the presence of those ancient stones keeping their vigil in the Turkish hills. They stand as guardians of memory, keepers of wisdom, bridges between the world that was and the world that is yet to be. They remind us that we are not alone in our search for meaning, that we are part of a great community of seekers that spans the ages, that connects us to everyone who has ever wondered about the nature of existence and our place within it. The stones of Göbekli Tepe have learned to speak, and we have learned to listen. In that conversation between ancient wisdom and modern hearts, between stone and spirit, between the eternal and the temporal, we find not answers, but something more precious, the understanding that the questions themselves are sacred, that the search itself is holy, that the very act of wondering is a form of worship. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the hills of Anatolia, ancient stones keep their patient vigil, holding within them the memories of our species' first great spiritual awakening. They have waited 11,000 years to tell their story, and they will wait 11,000 more if necessary. They are not going anywhere. They are not in any hurry. They understand something that we are still learning, that the most important truths cannot be rushed, that the deepest wisdom cannot be forced, that the sacred reveals itself only to those who approach it with patience, humility, and love. The conversation between stone and spirit continues, and we are all part of it. In our dreams tonight, we may find ourselves walking once more among those ancient pillars, feeling the weight of their presence, understanding without words the connection between the past and the present, the ancient and the eternal, the sacred, and the everyday. When stone begins to speak and we learn to listen, we discover that we have been having this conversation all along. We are not separate from the mystery, but part of it. Not observers of the sacred, but participants in it. Not seekers of truth, but embodiments of it. The stones of Göbekli Tepe have been waiting for us to remember this. And now, in the gentle darkness of the Anatolian night, we finally understand. The ancient temple sleeps, but it does not dream. It knows. It remembers. It waits. And in the quiet spaces between sleeping and waking, between knowing and wondering, between the stone that speaks and the heart that listens, the eternal conversation continues, as it has for 11,000 years, as it will for 11,000 more, as it must, until we finally understand what the stones have been trying to tell us all along, that we are home, that we have always been home, that the sacred is not something we need to find, but something we need to remember, something we need to become, something we already are.